in the chat box here, wherever you're watching, either Crowdcast live or LinkedIn Live or YouTube. Just drop in the comments box where you're joining from today. I'd love to hear where you're at today. So, happy Friday. We do these Friday live streams every Friday at this same time. For some of you, it might be early Saturday morning. If you happen to be up early in Asia Pacific, thank you for being up early to listen to this. And I'm excited for today's guest. We do these live streams every Friday with different guests and different topics related to digital transformation, business transformation, change management, all that kind of stuff. And today we're going to take a slightly different angle than what we've focused on in the past. And we're going to talk about private equity related firms and how digital transformations look or should look with private equity firms and what some of the nuances are and the differences and the things to think about if you're a high growth or a private equity backed organization, or if you're just a high growth company in general, even if you're not PE backed. A lot of these concepts we'll talk about here today are going to be relevant to you. So thanks again for being here. And last but not least, thank you, Stuart, for being here today.
Okay, thank you, Eric.
So just real quickly, before we set up the context a little bit more as far as this topic around PE, private equity, and digital transformations, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, Stuart. You're part of the Third Stage team, but maybe tell us what you do now and a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Stuart Robb. I'm Vice President of Third Stage European Practice. We operate predominantly at the moment in Western Europe. So we've got clients in France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, as well as the UK, of course. I've been doing ERPs since about 1998, started off in Anderson Consulting, then on to Ernst & Young, and then finally at Capgemini Australia, where I was Director of Transformation Consulting for a few years before freelancing on ERPs and CRM since about 2005. So I've got quite a lot of deep and wide experience of ERP, everything from SAP, Oracle, Aggresso, NetSuite, Microsoft Dynamics, and on and on and on it goes. So a reasonably broad church. And I've taken a particular interest in private equity. I've been involved in a number of private equity deals, the biggest one being the Micro Focus spin merge with Hewlett Packard's HP software division. That was in 2016, and I had some dealings with the ERP replacement program and its setup. I also have a number of PE clients in the UK and Europe. So Miraclon, Private Equity, A3 Capital, Aquilia, and a number of others, which we're currently working for on a number of clients of theirs, doing ERP advisory, future state, business process transformation, and various other activities of that nature. So I'm probably the one that picks up most of the PE stuff over in Europe, just because I can spell PE.
Right, and you know at a high level what it means.
Well, hopefully, yes. Don't ask me that question, though, will you?
So I guess it may sound like an overly basic question, but maybe just to start, just tell us what is private equity. I mean, maybe help us understand what private equity is and how it entails.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the difference between private equity and a public company is that the equity shares are owned by private shareholders, and they will either own a majority or minority stock, usually a majority stock in a particular company, and they may have bought that company, which has been spun out of a division of a larger firm. Like one of our clients was spun out of Kodak a couple of years ago, and so that spin was bought. Spinco was bought by a private equity firm, and now they own it, and they have board level representation. So basically, it's private financing, and usually the financing that the private equity firms arrange is funds that are provided by pension funds or banks or whatever, and they will make a private investment in a company, and then they will seek to gain a return on investment, both through improving the profitability of the company, and in some cases where it's not quite so good, is by selling off the assets or selling and leasing back the assets, or drawing down on the pension, overfunded pension schemes, in order to get a return on investment. And so, there was a recent case where Debenhams gone into private equity, and all of their real estate assets that they'd owned for 100 years were sold and leased back. And now, of course, Debenhams is, I think it's actually in administration. So there are some bad PE firms. There are some good PE firms. We try to work with the good PE firms, but not all of them are good.
Right. So before we get into this whole digital transformation discussion that we're going to get to here in a second, taking that your response there one step further. So PE firm has money to spend, and they're going to invest it in a company, and they want to get some sort of return on that investment, and they want to maximize value, grow the company, all that good stuff. What, just in general, how would you summarize how a PE firm typically gets involved in the day-to-day operations of the acquisition company that they're involved with?
It depends. My experience is that PE firms tend to be more active on the board than a PLC company, which may have its own board of directors. But those board of directors usually are fairly hands-off, whereas a PE firm will be much more directive. So where we get involved, typically we can get involved from the point of due diligence of the potential spinco, and we'll look at what their current systems and technology is doing, what their ERP, CRM, HCM, and all the rest of it looks like, and make observations as to whether or not we think that's a good investment, or they're just going to be in for a world of pain. And then once the acquisition has occurred and the deal's closed, then we will get involved in looking at what the future state of that organization should be. We will give advice on where we think they can automate, optimize processes, put in RPA, put in AI, and because obviously what they want to do is to leverage as much money as they can out of the company. So they need to raise profits, and they need to draw back on costs. And still, people are usually the highest cost in organizations. And so, obviously they will want to try to replace people through optimization of processes if that's practical to do. So we will typically go in initial 4-week engagement, look at what they've got, look at the landscape, look at the technology, look at how they're deploying it, and make some recommendations. Now, in some cases, they have no choice but to put a new complete IT architecture in. So where you're coming from a very, very large division of a major Fortune 500 or PLC, and you're $100 million company, then putting SAP in and replicating what they've got in, the Fortune 500 company would just be death by 1,000 cuts. It would be completely unsustainable. So quite often we will find that we will be putting a new ERP and the surrounding technology ecosystem in from scratch, which again requires the processes to be developed, organizational model, data model, data transformation, all of an organizational change manager, all of that stuff needs to go alongside, the implementation of that new tech.
Right. So everything you just said sounds on the surface like what any organization would need to do when they go through a digital transformation. But obviously that's not true. What we're talking about here today are the nuances of what, how a PE owned or a high growth organization would tackle a digital transformation differently. What are some of the nuances of what you just described, or anything else related to digital transformation at a high level that are unique or different when you're going through that process with a PE backed firm?
Well, there are a number of dynamics that operate, and it really depends on what type of deal is being done. So if we take an example of the deal where we've got a spinco from a large division, what's usual is you'll get something called a transitional service arrangement, a TSA, and that'll be a contract between the new entity, the spinco, and the old parent to provide IT services for a period of time, whilst the new the SpinCo, gets its IT infrastructure and its ERPs and all of that in place. Now, quite often, those TSAs have traditionally been put in place for 12 months. And 12 months is just not enough time to start from scratch and get an ERP up and running, which is why a lot of the ERPs that have been put into SpinCos are such a total and utter complete disaster. And so I've been working certainly with our clients to make sure that there is a longer window, typically 18 to 24 months, to get the ERP in and to get the data transferred. But there are a load of other gotchas, like in one contract, the parent company thought that what they'd agreed was to only transfer all of the data to the SpinCo once. And that's obviously useless, because you need to analyze the data, but you need the data at nearest possible go live. And so having it just once was bonkers, and it couldn't be done. So if you get in early and you're getting in on the due diligence side, you can influence where the lawyers are going with this and get much better terms. If you come in too late after the deal's already done and the lawyers have already walked away, then you end up usually with a whole pile of problems that you end up having to try and unpick and solve as you go. So those are the typical kind of nuances that are specific to private equity. Now, I've been talking a lot about SpinCos, but also there's the other kind of private equity, which is where they're funding startups. And we get, in London particularly, we've been funding a huge volume of tech startups over the past 2 years. And what we're seeing now is an increase in the number of tech startups that are outgrowing their instances of Xero and spreadsheets and now needing more sophisticated ERP. So that's also driving change in the marketplace. And so we've now got kind of two angles on this. One is the more traditional spin or SpinCo or spin merge or clone and go, whereas the ones that we're seeing more of just recently are the tech firms that are starting to outgrow the QuickBooks and the Xero that they put in place when they started.
Right. So when you think back to your opening response to what a PE firm does and what they're trying to accomplish, it sounds like a lot of what they're trying to do is grow. They want to grow the company, increase value, scale the company. How can PE-backed firms leverage a digital transformation in general to help scale the company? Do you have some examples of functions or technologies that might help enable that sort of scalability that the PE firms are often looking for?
Yeah, sure. Probably the thing that we haven't mentioned, which probably is useful, is that the PEs almost always have an exit timescale. So they will usually it's about 5 years. Sometimes it's a bit longer. Sometimes it's a bit shorter. But they want to make the investment, hold the asset for 5 years, having realized a certain level of profitability from the company that they're holding, and then sell it on. That could be to another private equity firm, or it could be back to the market. It might be to list it, or it might be to a division of another company. But that's basically what their aim is, and therefore their time horizon tends to be quite narrow. So some of the things that we tend to try and do, most organizations that we go into, whether they're SpinCos or they are tech startups, tend to have appallingly poor operational reporting. And so one of the areas that we focus on in digital transformation is trying to understand what the key drivers of the business are, and actually drive reporting that will draw out what's happening with those key drivers and whether they are trending positively or negatively. So BI takes quite a high prominence in what we try to do with these organizations. More generally, as I said, I mean, if you're coming out of a large company and you're creating a small company, then there's going to be very much a large company mentality. And so, well, we get this report from SAP, and I will, our team will typically go, well, what do you use the report for? Well, I don't know who uses it, but we get it, so we still need it. And I'm like, well, why? I said, well, because that's what SAP gives us. And, they can't even tell you who the audience is for the report, let alone what it's for or how it's created. And so there's a certain mindset in those kind of organizations you have to overcome, which is you cannot do things the way you did them, because the way you did them was for a multi-billion-dollar company, and you're not a multi-billion-dollar company. You have much flatter structures, and you need much more process efficiency. So a lot of the time, we're trying to redevelop processes to cut a lot of the wastage that they would have had when they had their existing large company processes. For the tech startups, the problem's different. Of course, a lot of them don't have any processes, or at least they don't have any processes they would acknowledge as processes. And a lot of things are done on spreadsheets. So getting them out of the spreadsheet mentality and into a more structured way of doing things. For example, there's quite a big company actually that was one of our clients that had a huge inventory stock. And they couldn't tell us what their stock turn was, i.e. how long a piece of stock was sitting in inventory before it had actually sold. And so they're carrying all this inventory on their balance sheet. They can't even tell us what the stock turn is. So they're manufacturing at 100% capacity to put stuff into stock, and their warehouses are getting fuller and fuller, and they don't know what the stock turn is. So those are the typical kind of things that we will walk into. And that's the right place to walk in, because if you say we need a new ERP and we want to do NetSuite, that is the wrong answer, because there's no business problem sat behind there. They've just seen a sales brochure, or they've watched it on YouTube and they've gone, that's good, that's what we need. If we get the right PE backing, we get to go in earlier and try and think about the problem statement, rather than just trying to replace a bit of technology with something else.
Yeah, and be a little bit more deliberate and focused in how you use technology, or even if you use technology. Sometimes it's not just a technology problem, or it's other problems.
Yeah, to set up an infrastructure from scratch is a lot of money. I mean, it will be a significant chunk of money out of the transitional budget that the PE will have set aside, and so you're absolutely right to say that not every problem is a nail that needs to be solved by a hammer. And so having some different tools, like if their particular problem is high volume of invoices and poor day sales outstanding, then actually a piece of focus technology like Remilia or I was going to say Blackline, who just took over Remilia, of course, or High Radius or Carivo, one of those products is going to be much more effective for them than putting in a whole new ERP, which probably isn't going to do a great deal more for them than the ERP they've already got.
Right. Yeah. Now we have a question that's semi-related to what you were talking about a moment ago, related to both ERP and reporting in general. But I'll start with the first question. This is from Sam Graham on Crowdcast. Welcome back to the live stream, Sam. Sam's a regular guest on the show, or a attendee of the show. But the question he has is, can a company be successful and sustainable without a good ERP system? That's the first part, and then I want to get to the second question as well.
It can be good and sustainable, but it can't be efficient, and it can't maximize its return on investment to its shareholders. And this goes back to something I said earlier. Technology isn't always the answer to everything. So one of our clients is a publishing firm, it's a multinational publishing firm. And it has, we've done a finance transformation for them, and it has an ERP, and it's fairly old, but it does what it says on the tin, right? It produces the accounts, it handles AP and AR, but it doesn't do it very well, and it doesn't handle reconciliations really very well at all. So again, in line with what I was suggesting about that other company, We ran a project for them to put high radius in to improve the accounts receivable. We ran a project to put Proactis in to improve the accounts payable. We put in Blackline to improve the reconciliation and the period end close process. We did a lot with them with Power BI on reporting and getting much more towards driver-based rolling forecasting rather than the traditional, static annualized reports that says we did this month last year and we're doing that this month this year. What does that tell us? Well, actually, it doesn't tell you very much at all, to be honest with you. So the whole idea of zero budgeting, they've moved away from. And we put an EPM tool. We didn't put it in. We helped manage the process of getting an EPM tool in for them to enable them to do DBRF. So can a company be successful and sustainable without a good ERP? Yes, because an ERP in of itself doesn't actually provide any business value. It's the improvements to DSO, improvements to DPO, higher accuracy in invoice processing, better movement of data, better reporting, better shorter period end close, and all of those things. Those are the things that add value. The ERP could be the thing that facilitates that, but it could equally be a bunch of different products, as in this instance, which can just be bolted on the front without causing too much disruption, and actually turned out to be cheaper.
Interesting. Yeah. You have to look at that cost benefit, risk reward of a big, massive ERP system versus more focused point solutions like you're talking about with high radius and some of these other EPM technologies. Second follow up here from Sam. And by the way, if anyone else has questions that's watching this live, we're all open, we're all ears as it relates to that. So feel free to drop those questions you might have in the chat on whichever platform you're watching on here. But the second part of Sam's question is, if reporting is so bad for some of these organizations, is that a sign that management needs to be replaced, or is that a technology issue, or is it both?
What a very good question. Some management don't know the art of the possible. Some managers are turnaround specialists, and therefore they will go in and turn a company around, but they are not long-term management, and therefore won't be focused on long-term operational or strategic, reporting. And everyone who is a manager, I mean, the thing is, we tend to think of management and CXOs as people who aren't like us, and they are. And they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses. Now, I know that if I can get the DSO down, then I free up then I improve our net free cash position, and I improve our low cash point, and therefore if we have banking covenants, then I relieve pressure on banking covenants, and so there's loads and loads of happy upsides. And the reason I know that is because I've done enough work with enough different organizations in finance and elsewhere to know that that is a good thing to do. And therefore, tunneling on DSO is a good thing. And investing in DSO and getting it lower is a good thing. Now, not every CXO, not every CEO, not every CIO will realize that. And so if we take that as an illustrative example, it needs someone really to demonstrate the art of the possible. Now, in the particular organization that I talked about, in terms of the stock turn, I mean, they're so profitable that nobody was caring. That's the problem. That they were green with cash, and so the fact that they were creating all this stock that they had no idea how long they were keeping or how long they were selling it, no one was asking the question. And because no one was asking the question, there was no impetus or need to answer it. Now, as I said, we were bought in because their ERP was failing to that particular organization, and they'd just been taken over by a US company. And so the US company wanted to go and do a bit of a nose about and see what was going on. And this all came up. I mean, they don't have a good handle on their supply chain. they are ordering materials stock that doesn't align to what they're actually producing, and so the material stock is going into warehouse for storage because they're completely not joined up, because it's all done by spreadsheets, but it's not visible. And if you looked at their accounts, you'd never see it. It's only because we went in there and we watched the whole workflow, and we said, well, why have you bought 25 million screws? And they said, well, we got them really, really, really cheap. And I said, well, yeah, but where are you going to put them? Oh, well, we'll stick them in that warehouse. Well, how long is that going to, how much is that going to cost you? Oh, well, we pay for all our warehouses centrally. And I said, yes, but if I divide the total cost of warehouses by the amount of money it's going to cost you to store these screws and distribute them to the manufacturing plant when they're required, how much is that? And they didn't know. And so it's that kind of stuff. It's only when someone comes in and starts, asking a few, insightful or incisive questions that you really start to understand whether the business is really getting good reporting and how it's managing it. Because if you manage it on a pure P&L basis, the company is fantastically profitable. We're making 28-30% margin. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Everybody's getting their bonuses and, going off to the Caribbean every year, but it doesn't mean the company is efficient.
Yeah, the profits are hiding the warts in those cases,
yeah,
and
exactly.
That's where a PE firm can come in and uncover those warts and say, okay, yeah, you're profitable, you're doing well, but there's a lot of money.
Here's another 13 points on your profit margin that you can get without doing much. Yeah,
exactly. And I suspect a lot of companies, not just PE owned companies, but more mature, larger organizations, smaller organizations. I imagine, whether the publicly traded, private, public sector, private sector, whatever it is, a lot of companies have that same problem. It's not
I mean, as I said, companies are a set of individuals who are all thrust together towards one theoretical common purpose. And the board of directors is no different. And each board will have its strengths and weaknesses. Each CEO, CFO, CIO will have their own particular focus, their own particular war stories, and their own particular experience. And that's not to say that I think that any organization is necessarily any better than any other. They're just different. And so, the drivers that drive different businesses, pretty much is down to how the people are rewarded, in terms of how they behave.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you were talking earlier about the implementation. What did you call it? The exit time scale. How long the PE firm wants to get out, basically. And that tends to put a lot of pressure on the implementation timeline as well as the cost. So how do PE firms, maybe start off by describing the tension that creates, the tension between being aggressive with time and cost, but also recognizing that there's a way to do it right. And if you are too aggressive on time and cost, that can actually diminish value. Maybe help us understand that dynamic and how PE-backed firms can be better suited to navigate that trade-off.
I mean, when I started dealing with PE firms, and we kind of first started to engage with them, although I came, with a lot of personal experience and credibility, I was seen as fairly low up the food chain, and therefore, if I was to say, in fact, at the Micro Focus deal, they were trying to implement 385 interfaces from design to fully tested and implemented in 11 months. And I said, that's more than one a day. You cannot possibly do it at that speed. It was just going to be a total and utter fiasco. And it was. Happily, I had long since bailed the sinking ship before it happened, and they decided to run it out of Palo Alto, which was fine. And I just had a new family, so I didn't want to go to Palo Alto anyway. So that gave me a good excuse to go. But yeah, that experience, there was no way that I had sufficient clout or excuse me, it's gone a bit. There we go. No way I had sufficient clout to make the point and make it stick. I think what's happened now is because I have much more experience of private equity than I did then. And I have much more credibility because I've been dealing with quite a number of people in private equity, and I've kind of got to know how they think. It's been easier for me to make the case to say that you are not leaving yourself enough time, and to produce some case studies where it's all gone horribly wrong, Micro Focus being one of them, that says don't do this. And by and large, after a bit of horse trading, they accept my decision, because actually the cost of the TSA, although it can be significant, is a hell of a lot cheaper than a complete balls up of an ERP and then having to start again from scratch, or try and use a hobbled system for 9 months while you try and fix all the problems. And that case is fairly easy to make. And as I said, we presented now to a couple of private equity firms, just on the subject of, get involved at the due diligence stage. Don't wait until the deal's closed to understand what you're getting yourself into. Don't listen to the tier one firms like EY or PwC, because they'll just tell you what you want to hear, because they ain't going to be around when it comes to actually implementing it. That message has got some traction, and we're going to continue to try to pursue that in the market, to make sure that message is heard louder. But it's like all things, it's more haste, less speed, right? If you spend 4 or 5 days looking at an ERP and say, does it meet our business needs, then you are running a significantly higher risk than if you spend 4 or 5 weeks. And the temptation is to get in there, go, we used NetSuite last time, let's use NetSuite for this time. And it's a completely different business. One was a drinks manufacturer, and the other one is a medical device company. They're not the same, and so the requirements are going to be quite significantly different. One needs recipe management, the other one needs material, FDA regulatory approval. They're not at all the same. So don't assume that just because NetSuite worked over here, it's going to work over here. But there is a lot of that temptation, and so you have to actually spend the time with the partner who is running the deal to actually walk them through why they're about to make a horrible cock up.
Right. Yeah, and you actually, as you were talking, that reminded me of a podcast interview we had on this show back in episode, it was either episode 2 or 3, is one of the very early episodes of Transformation Ground Control, and we had the CFO of Jane's Defense Weekly on.
James Hayward.
Yeah, James Hayward. And it was a really good discussion, awesome interview. If you haven't, those of you listening, if you haven't had a chance, go back and listen to either episode. I think it's either 2 or 3 of Transformation Ground Control, and James Hayward is a really good guest, because he was the CFO. And one of the things he talked about in that interview, I still remember very clearly. He was talking about how, they were in a PE type situation, a high growth situation, and they were on an aggressive timeline where I think they had it was around 12 months. They had about 12 months to do the full.
Well, originally it was 6, and I petitioned very, very hard to get it pushed out to a year.
Right.
Because they said they wanted in 6 months, and I said it's just not possible.
Happen for a company that size, yeah.
Yeah.
And he talked about, though, the importance of to go at that speed, even 12 months. That's aggressive. It's doable. 6 months is, I agree, not doable. But since this is a client of ours and you work closely with him and with that organization, maybe you could help us understand in that case study or that example. He talked about how they spent about half the time on planning and just getting prepared for the implementation, but they spent a very high.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, so to give you a bit of background, they were spun out of IHS Markit, which is a multi-billion, 15,000 person company, and they're like 100 people. And so, again, the original assumption was, well, let's clone their SAP instance and run SAP. And I'm like, you can't possibly run SAP for a company with 100 people. You'll need 100 people just to run SAP. It's just a non-starter. And the SAP that they had was very old and out of date anyway, and it would have just been a horrible nightmare. We short-circuited a bit because I'd already done some work for another client about functional fit for NetSuite in publishing. So I was fortunate enough to have already got a reasonably good understanding of whether NetSuite would work or not. And the other thing was that I'd actually also found a systems integrator who I thought would be perfect to do the job. So I actually walked into that situation probably a lot further forward than some of the others, where I've gone in and I've had to look and understand the business before I'm starting to try to work out what their direction and strategy should be. That said, I mean, we did go in, we did do a number of workshops which defined the operating model. We didn't worry about the technology, but how many A people are we going to need? How many AR people are we going to need? Where should they be? How many people for tax? How are we going to do FP&A? We started there, and what we did was they started building their organization and their processes and their policies and procedures, whilst we were still looking at the technology and making sure that it would functionally fit. So we started off with the standard process taxonomy, and we talked quite a high level about how we thought it should work. And then the place that we really had to deep dive was subscription revenue, because theirs was a subscription business. And at that time, NetSuite didn't have a subscription billing module. And we were a bit lucky because NetSuite were releasing a subscription billing module in the time scale that we were going to go live with this thing. And we had to take a bit of a punt as to whether or not we believed this subscription module was actually going to work or not. And ordinarily, I'd say never ever take version 1 of a product, but in this instance, we didn't really have an awful lot of choice. So this parallel track of activity. Now, bear in mind, they didn't actually have any finance function at all. There was no finance function inherited from IHS Markit. They had to recruit them all. So they were recruiting people into the business that knew nothing about the business, which in itself was difficult because the SI wanted requirements and wanted to know how things should be set up, and there was no one to ask. In addition, we got a data dump from SAP, which was literally a dump of data. Even the columns didn't mean anything. And so there was a lot of time that we had to spend working out what that data was, how it all connected together in terms of its referential integrity, what data out of that dump we actually needed, and what was basically just rubbish that we didn't need. So yes, I mean, about 6 months of planning. I think that's about right. I think actually we started in well, I think the deal closed in January. I think we were on it just before we got involved in December on some of the due diligence stuff and the approach. And I think we actually started coding the solution, effectively configuring NetSuite in towards the end of May. But by that time, everyone had become really ultra familiar with what was required. And so, the data, the OCM, the building of the team, all of that was all able to happen pretty much simultaneously. And we managed to get it over the line. It was not the easiest of things to get it over the line. There was lots and lots of weekend working and lots of extended hours. So, was 12 months enough? If we'd been doing an 8-hour day, the answer would have been no. The fact that we were doing sort of 7 days a week on a 2 rotation shift, the answer was yes.
Yeah. And I think that what's interesting about that whole case study or that example is that it runs counterintuitive to what our natural instincts are. Oftentimes, our natural instincts are, I've got 12 months. I better start doing something now. I better
Yeah.
get NetSuite in here. I'll start configuring it or whatever the technology is.
Yeah, and
Take it
I
easier.
mean, we didn't even have a chart of accounts when we started, and I said, get it wrong now, it'll be wrong forever. So
Yeah.
think it through really carefully. And I think that I think that the thing is, James and I had worked together on a number of other engagements before. I've known James for years because he knew the way I worked and because he understood the process that I went through. He was much more willing to carry the method and the thinking through than I think someone who hadn't experienced the sort of third stage way of doing it, whose natural reaction is get the product in, start configuring it straight away. And then, of course, the wheels start to come off it in 3 or 4 months because everyone's trying to hack at it without having really thought through what they wanted to do or how it's going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a great point. I mean, it's almost like you need to take a step back to be able to take two steps forward. And
Yeah.
you're actually, one of the comments he made in that interview too, by the way, was that it's a lot more. Um, he was actually able to implement a lot faster because he took that time up front. So
Yeah.
overall, he felt like it was a faster deployment.
It's always the same. And I keep saying it over and over again to every client: more haste, less speed. And in fact, we have a med device client at the moment who we pitched at about 6 months ago. And we said, this is the methodology that we go through. We look at operating model, we do this, this, and this, and this. And they decided not to go with us. They went with another organization. And we got contacted by them a couple of months ago to say they'd kind of got a bit stuck and they needed a bit of advice and guidance. And I said, fine, where have you got to? And they said, we got to this stage. We're talking to tool suppliers, and we're shocked when I said, well, we've got another customer who's also in med devices who started a month later than you, and we're basically down to the final selection. And it was all because we were much better prepared. Or so that customer was much better prepared, and so we've been now helping this customer, get themselves into a position where they've got all of the information they need in order to be able to go out to tender. But it is preparation. There's an old saying: poor preparation leads to oh God, what is it? Poor planning leads to piss poor performance, I think it is. Apologies for the vernacular, but it's some old army saying, but it's absolutely true. I mean, they didn't do D-Day by going, oh, quick, we need to invade France. Let's get a few boats together, throw some soldiers in it, and sail across to France. If anyone's ever had the pleasure, which I have, of looking at the D-Day plans, that they planned absolutely everything. I mean, the plans go into tens of thousands of pages. They're available online on the Imperial War Museum website, I think it is. But yeah, I mean, really, 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 really long planning cycle. 2 years that took. Thousands of elements in that plan.
Yeah, and with that 2-year lead time, that probably was faster than if they would have just gone in and done what you
Well,
said.
I think if they'd gone in and they didn't have the Mulberry ports and they didn't know what they were landing on, whether it was hard or soft sand and a million other things, they didn't know what they were facing in terms of opposition. They would have lasted 5 minutes, which is basically what happened a few years earlier at Dunkirk.
Right.
Not wishing to turn this into not Dunkirk, I think it was at Calais they tried to invade. Can't remember now. Not trying to turn this into a history lesson. Apologies.
I was just going to say there's a whole
especially
other direction we can go.
Especially as we're showing my sudden weakness in history as I'm being put on the spot for it.
Well, that's actually interesting. I didn't know you could go read those plans, so I might go actually look that
Yeah,
up.
no, they are public domain.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you may have already, I think you've already uncovered one thing or one potential response to this question already, but it's about the blind spots that PE firms have, or some of the risks or pitfalls that PE-backed firms are more likely to fall into. And I think we've touched on one, which is the time pressure, and cutting too many corners or cutting the wrong corners as part of that time pressure can be one common challenge or pitfall. What are some of the other pitfalls that you see that are more common or unique to PE-backed firms with digital transformation?
It's very interesting. I mean, every PE firm has a slightly different dynamic. One of the more interesting aspects I've found is that because the PE firms tend to be much more active in the board, there's a much finer line between what a PE firm wants to happen in terms of directing a company what they want, and the executive directors who are actually accountable for it. So in good corporate governance, in good corporate governance, while this keeps going out of focus, in good corporate governance, it would ordinarily be the executives that are making the final say and carrying the final can. But in PE-backed companies, I found that the PE representatives on the board tend to be much more, or can be much more directive, which can lead to a, I don't know why this isn't working. Apologies.
It's all right. It's got that indie movie feel to it when you're out of focus.
Yeah. Okay. No, I give up. But yeah, they're much more directive, and that can lead to some conflicts of opinion about what should happen and how it should be done between the board and the PE firm. And so when we're dealing with PE, particularly, we have to be mindful that it's not only the PE firm that we're reporting to, we're also reporting to the company for whom is actually the work is being done. And so we have to have an equally good relationship with the CXOs and the executive suite as we do as the PE contacts, and take all views into account. Now, ordinarily, we wouldn't care really who was on the board in a normal company. We would just talk to the CFO or the CXO or CIO, CEO, whoever it was, and then we'd get on with it. But there's a slightly different dynamic, and then if you don't understand that dynamic, you can get yourself into quite a lot of hot water.
Yeah. Now, what about the rapid pace of change? You sort of alluded to the what was the example you gave about companies that just don't have reporting or visibility into their inventory. You were talking about the inventory stockpiling and imposing some sort of massive change, any sort of massive change and fast change to an organization creates a lot of change management pressure and that sort of thing.
Well, PE firms in particular are going to impose change anyway. I mean, as I said, in some organizations, a finance function doesn't exist. You have to build one from scratch. And creating a cohesive organization that's going to work in harmony, knowing all what they're doing and what the company is doing, and having all of the ironed out processes and procedures in 6 months, is a massive undertaking. I mean, the change management issues you have there are much more significant than you would have in a normal change program, where it's, broadly speaking, the people are going to remain largely the same. Again, the board or the executive board that comes together are probably all new. Half of them are going to be interim contractors anyway. Interim CIO, interim CFO, going to be gone in 6 months. And then you have the opposite problem, which is you get the old timers who've all been in the large PLC or the large Fortune 100 company for the last 25 years, and now they've been thrust into this little tiny firm. And all of a sudden, rather than have this insulation of management around them, who are basically able to take the decision and take all the pressure off them, they suddenly find themselves being the CFO, and now they have to take the decision. They have to know what they're doing. They don't have anyone to rely on. And so, again, you have this leadership vacuum because they've never been in a position where they've had the ultimate accountability or the ultimate responsibility, and you often find they become quite timid at taking decisions because they've never been in a position where it's all rested on their shoulders. And so what we try and do is to coax and to coach, and we don't specifically call it, and it depends who you're dealing with. I mean, I tend to find that the same names keep coming up. You mentioned James Hayward, and he keeps coming up in different PE ventures that I get involved in because he's a specialist turnaround and private equity CFO that's put in to manage that process. And the same with Darren Price, is the ex I think he was the ex-CIO of Royal Sun Alliance, but now he does mostly PE and turnaround work. And so you tend to find the same names. And if you're working with those names over and over again, it becomes quite easy. But if you're working with a set of new names, that have come from, the likes of large PLC, and they don't know what they're doing, then you've really got to hold their hand quite a lot and get their trust before you really start getting them to start helping them to start make the really difficult decisions. And it's trust. It's all about trust. Anything to do with consulting, as I'm sure you know it, but maybe not everybody on the call knows, is all about establishing a level of trust. If the client trusts you and they trust the advice you're giving them, and that advice is well reasoned, then the higher chances that they'll go with the advice you're giving them. If they don't trust you, or they're getting multiple different voices giving them conflicting information, that's when these decisions become difficult.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what are some of the ways that you've seen organizations deal with that? That rapid pace of change, that massive disruption. You look at a Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 company that has 3 or 4 or 5 years to go through their entire transformation. These PE-backed firms don't have that luxury. They're not usually in it for that long, and they don't have the patience to do that. So the change is faster. It's more dramatic oftentimes because for some reason. How do they manage that?
Funnily enough, actually, the general modus operandi of a PE firm is to change as little as possible. I mean, they suffer from a certain amount of change inertia. And mostly that's because they themselves haven't necessarily uncovered what unrealized profits are by changing the organization. And so if they've taken over a firm, mid-size SME firm that's running reasonably well in their eyes, they'll probably leave it alone. And it's only when some critical tipping point happens, for example, that tipping point could be the ERP going out of support or running out of capacity. Will they actually think about changing their technology platform, which will then tentacle through the organization and start to draw out changes that are required elsewhere? So it doesn't necessarily follow that every PE firm goes in there champing at the bit to change everything. In fact, usually it's quite the opposite. They want to change as little as possible, but more often than not, they will be forced into change purely by virtue of the fact that they're going to be taking the company into a different structure, and therefore the underlying operational environment will have to change with it.
Right. Yeah. So, so we have a white paper that you actually authored, and it's the private equity.
It's a magnum opus.
Right. It is an epic document that I encourage everyone listening to download, and I'll include a link to that in the description field below. But what are some of the? I know you can't read that to us here in the time we have. We have just a couple of minutes left, but as a kind of a closing question, what are a couple of highlights that may have been covered in that playbook that we might take away or summarize as far as just other things we haven't covered that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've talked a lot about SpinCos, and there are other PE models. I mentioned, I think, very briefly, clone and goes and spin merges. So the document talks about some of those differences and what they mean and how you might look at those. The other thing the document explores as well is how to assess, certainly in due diligence, how good a acquisition target is in terms of its infrastructure and its ability to provide reporting, and gives you a reasonably good understanding of what you're going to be facing into when you actually get this company on your books. We talk a little bit as well about how to identify through the architecture, any architecture diagrams that they give you in the due diligence. You can infer quite a lot in terms of history, in terms of where that architecture has come from, So again, there's stuff in the booklet that will give you ways of being able to infer information that you might not get straight from the seller or the parent company when you're going through PE. So it's got lots of information, lots of data that you can use to kind of assess not only what you're looking at in terms of pre-due diligence acquisition, but what you should do with the acquisition once it's into post-merger.
Right.
We got another question, by the way, from Sam.
Yeah, it's actually a good question. Are you sometimes brought in because a company wants a scapegoat rather than a solution? Wrong opinion on that, but I'm curious what you think.
We don't do scapegoating in third stage. Our contractual terms and conditions mean that we can't possibly be scapegoated for anything.
Right.
I mean, just to be clear on that, I mean, I'm being obviously slightly facile, but we advise, we don't decide. Yeah, we're like the civil service. The minister decides, the civil servants don't decide. So if a board decides to do it on a course of action, then we accept their decision, even if we don't necessarily completely agree with it. But it's their decision and it's theirs to live with. We are only the advisors. And if it's the wrong decision, well, then, that there is a collective board responsibility that they have to face into. I would like to say, and I think I can say in almost all cases, that all of the advice that we have given has been best advice that we felt would be the best for the companies concerned. Not all of the decisions that the organizations have taken have followed that advice, and some of those decisions have proven to be fine, but that doesn't necessarily invalidate the advice that we gave. And some of them have proven not to be fine, and we don't really want to put up a banner that you can see from Mars saying "I told you so," but we do resist doing that. But it's actually I don't think there has been an instance where we have recommended a course of action which has turned disastrously wrong. And that's because actually it's quite difficult to make a wrong decision. It's about how you implement it and whether you have the structure and the management actually to make it work. I mean, it's never come across a situation where we said, yes, we think NetSuite's the right solution for you, or Infor M3 is the right solution for you, and it's turned out to be total pants. Usually it's simply because the implementation has just not been handled effectively.
Yeah. I'd say the bigger challenge that we have is that we get hired to tell, or the clients expect us at times to tell them what they want to hear, not necessarily what they need to hear.
Yeah. Well, if you want a consultancy to come and tell you what you want to hear as opposed to what you need to hear, you can go and buy a parrot because they're a lot cheaper.
Right. That's a great point. Save a lot of money and time. All right. Well, good. Well, thanks for being here, Stuart. Really appreciate you taking the time on a Friday evening, your time. I know you're getting in here, so I appreciate you being here, and appreciate all the guests that have had questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. There's a couple more here on LinkedIn we didn't get to, but we'll try to answer those offline in the comment section on LinkedIn. So thanks everyone for joining. Again, we do this every Friday, same time, same place. We're live on LinkedIn. We're live on YouTube, Crowdcast, and Twitter. So any of those platforms, you can watch us at the same time, or you can watch it on demand after the fact in our Transformation Ground Control podcast when that comes out every Wednesday. So this interview will be featured a week from this coming Wednesday. You'll see this interview longer form podcast. So thanks for being here today, and we hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.